After my husband passed away, my son became the CEO of the family business, and I pretended I hadn't inherited anything. The next day, my daughter-in-law said, "That useless old woman is going to eat up all our money. Throw her in a nursing home. I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I was arranging fresh lilies in the living room when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drift from the kitchen. The words stopped me cold. "This useless old woman is going to eat through all our money. We need to throw her in a nursing home." Lilia's voice carried that sharp edge it always had when she thought I couldn't hear her. I stood frozen behind the doorway, the flower stems slipping from my trembling fingers. "I don't know, Lilia." My son Blaine's voice was hesitant. "She's still my mother." "Your mother?" Lilia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Blaine, wake up. She's a burden. Look at this house. She shuffles around here like some ghost, contributing nothing. We're paying for her food, her medications, everything. And for what?" My chest tightened. 6 months ago, I'd buried my husband of 42 years. Richard had built Hartwell Industries from nothing, and I'd stood beside him every step of the way. Now his son spoke about me like I was some stray animal they'd taken in out of pity. "She doesn't even know how to use the computer to manage any of Dad's affairs," Lilia continued. "Face it, she's useless. And expensive." I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The funeral seemed like yesterday. I could still smell the lilies that had covered Richard's casket, still feel the weight of Blaine's arm around my shoulders as he whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Everything. That included me, apparently. "There are some nice facilities." Lilia's voice grew more animated. "Not too expensive. She'd have other people her age to talk to. It would be better for everyone. Better for everyone." The words echoed in my mind as I stood there in my own living room. The room where Richard and I had raised Blaine, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we'd built a life together. "I suppose you're right," Blaine finally said, and something inside me cracked. "She does seem lost without Dad. Maybe being around other people would help." Lost. As if grief were some kind of mental deficiency. I thought about the papers I'd signed just days after the funeral. The ones Blaine had rushed to me with tear-filled eyes. Just formalities. "Mom," he'd said, "legal stuff for the business. Dad would want me to handle everything now." What Blaine didn't know, what neither of them knew, was what those papers really contained. Richard had been cleverer than they imagined. Much cleverer. I owned 75% of Hartwell Industries. The business they thought Blaine had inherited. The money they were so eager to spend. The future they were planning. It all belonged to me. Richard had structured it that way years ago, protecting our assets in ways that wouldn't be discovered unless someone looked very, very carefully. But I'd let them believe the lie. I'd played the grieving widow, confused by legal terms and grateful to let her capable son handle the complicated business matters. It had seemed easier than fighting, easier than confronting the ugly truth about who my son had become. "When should we start looking at places?" Blaine asked. "I'll make some calls tomorrow," Lilia replied. "The sooner the better. I'm tired of tiptoeing around her. Tiptoeing around me, in my own home." I heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved toward the staircase, climbing as quietly as my 70-year-old knees would allow. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed Richard and I had shared for decades, staring at the framed photo of our wedding day. "They don't know, do they?" I whispered to his smiling face. "They have no idea what you really left behind." Richard had always been protective of me, sometimes to a fault. "Promise me," he'd said during those final weeks in the hospital. "If something happens to me, if Blaine ever treats you poorly, you'll use what I'm leaving you. Don't let anyone push you around, Sloan." I'd promised, but I'd never imagined I'd need to keep that promise so soon. The next morning, Lilia cornered me over breakfast. Blaine had already left for the office that was technically mine, and she sat across from me with that practiced smile she used when she wanted something. "Sloan, honey, we need to talk." I continued buttering my toast. not trusting my voice. Blaine and I have been thinking about your living situation. We know how lonely you must be in this big house. Lonely, as if the house itself were the problem, not the fact that my own family treated me like an unwelcome stranger. We found some lovely senior communities, places where you'd have activities, people your own age. You might actually enjoy it. I looked up at her then, really looked at her. Lilia was 35, beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that came from expensive treatments and careful maintenance. She'd married Blaine 3 years ago, and I'd tried so hard to welcome her, to be the mother-in-law she needed. Now I could see what I'd been blind to before, the way her eyes assessed everything in the room like an appraiser, the way she spoke about my future as if it were already decided. "When?" I asked quietly. She blinked, clearly surprised I wasn't arguing. "Well, we thought maybe next week. I've already scheduled a tour for Thursday." Next week. They'd already made the appointment. "I see," I said, returning to my toast. "You're not upset, are you?" Lilia's voice carried a note of suspicion. "I mean, this is really what's best for everyone." I met her eyes and smiled the same polite smile I'd been wearing for months. "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." But inside, something was shifting. Richard's voice echoed in my memory. "Don't let anyone push you around, Sloane." The time for being pushed around was over. Sunset Manor wasn't the lovely senior community Lilia had described. The beige walls were stained with water damage, the carpet smelled of disinfectant and something else I didn't want to identify, and my room was barely larger than a hotel bathroom. "This is temporary," Blaine had mumbled when he'd helped carry my 2 allowed suitcases inside. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Just until we figure out the best long-term solution." That was 3 weeks ago. I hadn't heard from him since. I sat in the common room, watching Mrs. Chen play solitaire with a deck missing the Queen of Hearts. Through the window, I could see my former life continuing without me. The maple tree in the courtyard was turning the same brilliant red it had in my backyard every October for 40 years. "You're the new one, aren't you?" The voice belonged to Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who used a walker but moved with surprising speed. "Your family dump you here too?" I turned from the window. "Something like that." Eleanor snorted. "They always have their reasons. Mine said I was becoming a safety risk after I fell down once. Once. 30 years I raised those kids, and one little tumble means I'm incompetent." The common room filled with the usual afternoon crowd. Most residents shuffled in wearing the same defeated expression, as if they'd given up expecting anything good to happen. I understood that feeling now. "What did you do before this?" Eleanor asked, settling into the chair beside me. "I helped run a business, with my husband." It wasn't technically true, but it felt true. Richard and I had been partners in everything. "What kind of business?" "Manufacturing, industrial parts." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Sounds important." It was. I watched a group of residents arguing over the television remote. "My son runs it now." "Ah," Eleanor nodded knowingly. "And how's that working out?" I thought about the reports I'd been secretly receiving from Marcus, Richard's old attorney. Blaine had made 3 major decisions in the past month, all of them terrible. He'd canceled contracts with longtime suppliers to chase cheaper alternatives, laid off experienced workers to cut costs, and approved a new product line without proper market research. "Not well," I admitted. "They never listen, do they? Think because we're old, we don't know anything." Eleanor's voice carried decades of frustration. "My daughter reorganized my entire financial portfolio without asking me. Lost 20% in the first 6 months. That evening, I called Marcus from the payphone in the hallway. The connection was crackling and poor, but his voice was clear enough. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm glad you called. We need to discuss the Riverside account." Riverside was Hartwell Industries' biggest client, responsible for nearly 30% of annual revenue. "What about it?" "Your son terminated the contract yesterday, said he found a better opportunity." My grip tightened on the phone. Richard had cultivated the Riverside relationship for 15 years. What better opportunity? A startup company. No established track record. They're offering 15% higher margins, but Mrs. Hartwell, Marcus paused. I've done some research. They're funded by venture capital that's already showing signs of stress. This could be a disaster. I closed my eyes, feeling Richard's presence like a whisper in my ear. He'd always said the most dangerous time for any business was when inexperienced hands took control during emotional periods. Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Quietly. Of course. I want you to document every decision Blaine makes, every contract change, every personnel move, every financial choice. Can you do that without him knowing? Absolutely. And Mrs. Hartwell, there's something else. Your daughter-in-law has been asking questions about your personal assets. She seems to think you might have hidden accounts or property she doesn't know about. I almost laughed. Lilia's greed was showing. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if you had any stocks, bonds, or real estate holdings that weren't part of the general estate. I told her I couldn't discuss client confidentiality matters, but she was quite persistent. Of course she was. Lilia had probably been counting every penny they thought they'd inherited, and now she was worried there might be more money floating around that they couldn't access. Don't tell her anything, I said. And Marcus, I want you to start preparing some paperwork for me. I may need to make some changes soon. When I returned to my room, I found my roommate, Mrs. Patterson, sitting on her bed, looking distressed. She was holding a letter, her hands shaking. Bad news? I asked gently. My grandson, she whispered. He was supposed to visit last weekend, and the weekend before. He keeps promising, but... She didn't need to finish. I'd seen this pattern in other residents. The promises that gradually became excuses, the visits that grew farther apart, the phone calls that stopped coming altogether. I raised him after his parents died, Mrs. Patterson continued. Sacrificed everything to give him a good life. And now he's too busy to spend an hour with me. I sat on my own narrow bed, studying the woman across from me. She'd given everything to family, just like I had. Just like Eleanor had. Just like most of the women in this place. Mrs. Patterson, I said carefully, did you ever think about what you'd do if you had the power to change things? If you weren't as helpless as they think you are? She looked up, confused. What do you mean? Just a thought experiment. If you could somehow take control of your own life again, would you? Her eyes brightened for the first time since I'd known her, in a heartbeat. That night, I lay in my narrow bed listening to Mrs. Patterson's gentle snoring and Eleanor's muttered complaints from down the hall. Through the thin walls, I could hear someone crying softly in the next room. This place was full of women who'd been discarded, told they were burdens, convinced they were powerless. But I wasn't powerless. I just hadn't decided to use my power yet. I thought about Blaine sitting in Richard's office, making decisions that would destroy everything his father had built. I thought about Lilia, probably redecorating my house with money she thought was hers, selling my personal belongings like they were garage sale items. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call Marcus again. It was time to remind my family that power doesn't always come in the package they expect. Outside my window, a storm was building. I could see lightning flickering in the distance, and the wind was picking up, rattling the old building's windows. The storm wasn't just outside, though. It was growing inside me, too, and Blaine and Lilia had no idea what was coming their way. There has to be more money somewhere. Lilia's voice carried down the hallway of Sunset Manor as she and Blaine approached my room. I quickly closed the financial documents Marcus had brought me and slipped them under my pillow. Through the crack in my door, I could see them walking with purpose, Lilia clutching a manila folder. Mom? Blaine knocked softly. Can we come in? I arranged myself on my bed, making sure to look frail and confused. Of course, dear. They entered my cramped room, and I watched Lilia's nose wrinkle at the institutional smell. She was wearing a new coat. Cashmere by the look of it. Expensive. My money, probably. How are you feeling? Blaine asked, but his eyes were darting around the room, not really seeing me. Oh, you know. Some days are better than others. I let my voice quaver slightly. The food here isn't very good. Lilia shot Blaine a look that said, get on with it. She was never good at hiding her impatience. Mom, we need to ask you about some financial matters, Blaine said, settling into the room's single chair. When Dad died, there were some inconsistencies in the paperwork. I blinked slowly, playing confused. What kind of inconsistencies? Lilia couldn't contain herself any longer. Sloan, we found references to accounts and assets that aren't in the estate documents. We need to know what Richard might have hidden from us. Hidden from us. Not hidden from me. Hidden from them. I don't understand, I said. Your father handled all the financial matters. I never really paid attention to those things. It was partially true. Richard had handled the day-to-day operations, but I'd been involved in every major decision. We'd been partners in everything, even if I'd preferred to work behind the scenes. Blaine leaned forward. Mom, this is important. The business is having some cash flow problems, and if there are additional assets... Cash flow problems. Marcus had told me about those. Blaine's terrible decisions were already catching up with him. What kind of problems? I asked innocently. Lilia and Blaine exchanged another look. Nothing serious, Lilia said quickly. Just normal business fluctuations, but we need to have a complete picture of all available resources. Available resources. They meant my resources. I really don't know anything about hidden accounts, I said truthfully. There weren't any hidden accounts, just accounts they didn't know belonged to me. Your father always said I didn't need to worry about money matters. Think, Mom. Blaine's voice carried a note of desperation. Did he ever mention offshore accounts? Investment properties? Stocks in other companies? I studied my son's face. The stress was showing. Dark circles under his eyes. A nervous tic I remembered from his childhood when he'd done something wrong. The weight of running a company he didn't understand was crushing him. Part of me felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard. The dismissive way they'd discussed putting me somewhere with other people my age, and my sympathy evaporated. There might be some old papers in the house, I said slowly, in your father's study, but I'm not sure what they mean. Lilia's eyes lit up. What kind of papers? Investment statements, I think. Some legal documents. They're in the filing cabinet behind his desk. It was true, though the documents they'd find wouldn't tell them what they wanted to know. Richard had been careful to keep certain information in very specific places, accessible only to people who knew exactly what to look for. We'll check those, Blaine said, standing up. Is there anything else you can remember? I let myself look tired and overwhelmed. I'm sorry. Sometimes my memory isn't what it used to be. Another partial truth. My memory was fine, but grief and stress had made me more forgetful about small things. About the important things, like who owned what and where Richard had hidden our real assets, my mind was crystal clear. After they left, I waited 20 minutes before calling Marcus from the hallway phone. They're getting desperate, I told him. How bad are things at the company? Worse than I thought. The Riverside contract cancellation has triggered a chain reaction. 2 other major clients are reconsidering their relationships with Hartwell Industries. Your son is scrambling to cover operating expenses. I closed my eyes. Richard had built that company over 30 years. Watching Blaine destroy it in a matter of months was like watching someone tear down a cathedral brick by brick. There's something else, Marcus continued. Your daughter-in-law hired a private investigator to look into your background, specifically, your financial background. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of investigation? They're looking for hidden assets, undisclosed investments, anything that might not have been included in the probate documents. She's convinced you're hiding money from them. The irony was almost funny. They were looking for hidden money when the money they thought they had wasn't really theirs to begin with. Marcus, I need you to accelerate our timeline. How quickly can you prepare the documents we discussed? I can have everything ready by Friday. Are you sure you want to do this? I thought about my cramped room, about Mrs. Patterson crying over her grandson's broken promises, about Eleanor's daughter stealing her money, about the way Lilia had looked at me like I was garbage cluttering up her perfect life. I'm sure. That afternoon, I was sitting in the common room when Eleanor approached with a newspaper in her hand. Thought you might want to see this, she said, spreading the business section on the table between us. The headline made my stomach drop. Local manufacturing company faces major layoffs. The article was about Hartwell Industries. According to sources close to the company, I read aloud, Hartwell Industries has lost several major contracts in recent months, forcing management to consider significant workforce reductions. The company, which has been family-owned for over 30 years, is struggling to adapt to changing market conditions under new leadership. New leadership. They meant Blaine. "That your son's company?" Eleanor asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "Sounds like he's in over his head." I thought about all the employees who'd worked for Richard for years, people I'd known personally, families who depended on their Hartwell Industries paychecks. Blaine wasn't just destroying his father's legacy. He was destroying real people's lives. "Eleanor," I said suddenly, "what would you do if you had the power to stop something terrible from happening, but using that power would hurt someone you love?" She looked at me shrewdly. "Depends on how much hurt we're talking about. Sometimes the people we love need to face consequences for their actions. Sometimes that's the only way they learn." That evening, Mrs. Patterson showed me a photo her grandson had finally sent. A picture of his new car, a BMW. Very expensive. "He said he's been too busy with work to visit," she said proudly. "But he's doing so well for himself." I stared at the photo, remembering Lilia's new coat, thinking about all the ways money could corrupt people, make them forget what really mattered. My grandson had bought a car instead of visiting his grandmother who'd raised him. My son had inherited a thriving business and was running it into the ground. My daughter-in-law was hunting for more money to spend while I ate cafeteria food in a nursing home. The time for protecting people from consequences was over. I went to bed that night with my mind made up. Friday couldn't come soon enough. The phone call came at 6 in the morning. I was already awake, sitting by my window watching the sunrise, when the payphone in the hallway began ringing insistently. Most residents ignored early calls, assuming they were wrong numbers or emergencies meant for someone else. But I knew this call was for me. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Marcus's voice was tense. "I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a situation." "How bad?" "Your son is filing for emergency bankruptcy protection. The company is hemorrhaging money faster than anyone anticipated. He's desperate." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar mix of sorrow and vindication. Richard had always said that pride comes before the fall, and Blaine's pride had been enormous. What triggered it? The Johnson contract. You remember Johnson Manufacturing? They've been with Hartwell for 15 years. Your son tried to renegotiate their terms, demanding a 20% price increase. They walked away yesterday and signed with a competitor. Johnson Manufacturing represented 12% of Hartwell's annual revenue. Combined with the Riverside loss and the other canceled contracts, Blaine had managed to lose nearly half the company's income in 2 months. "There's more," Marcus continued. "Your daughter-in-law has been liquidating personal assets. The house is going on the market today. My house. The house where I'd raised Blaine, where Richard and I had celebrated 42 anniversaries, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by memories. She can't sell my house," I said, though even as I spoke the words I knew she could. Legally, it wasn't my house anymore. I'd signed it over to Blaine after the funeral, trusting him to let me live there as long as I wanted. Trust. Such a fragile thing. "Actually, she can," Marcus said gently. "According to the documents you signed, the house belongs to Blaine now, and since he's married, Lilia has equal rights to make decisions about it." I thought about all my belongings still inside. Photo albums, Richard's books, my grandmother's china, 42 years of accumulated memories. Things that couldn't be replaced. What about my personal items? "I'm afraid they're considered part of the household assets now, unless you can prove specific items were gifts or have sentimental value that predates the marriage." He didn't need to finish. Proving sentimental value in court would be expensive and time-consuming, and I was supposed to be a confused old woman with no money. "Are they moving forward with the sale immediately?" "The realtor is taking photos this afternoon. They're pricing it to sell quickly." I hung up the phone and stood in the hallway for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. My son was destroying everything his father had built, and my daughter-in-law was selling my memories to pay for their mistakes. The anger that rose in my chest was white-hot and clean. I called Blaine's office, knowing he'd be there early, probably staring at spreadsheets and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Mom? His voice was exhausted. How did you get this number? I called the main line and asked for you. Simple truth. Blaine, I heard about the company. Are you all right? A long pause. Who told you about the company? It's in the newspaper, dear. And some of the other residents here have family who work in manufacturing. Word gets around. I'm handling it, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. It's just a temporary setback. Blaine. I let my voice carry all the authority I'd learned over 40 years of partnership with his father. Bankruptcy protection isn't temporary. It's admitting defeat. You don't understand business. Mom, this is just a strategic reorganization. The condescension in his tone sparked something dangerous in me. Richard would have been ashamed of the man his son had become. I understand that your father built that company from nothing, I said quietly, and you've destroyed it in 2 months. That's not fair. What's not fair is watching you throw away 30 years of work because you're too proud to admit you don't know what you're doing. Silence on the other end. Blaine, I need to ask you something and I want an honest answer. Are you selling my house? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, we need the capital. The house is just sitting there, and with your medical expenses and the nursing home costs, my medical expenses, my voice rose. What medical expenses? I take 2 prescription medications that cost less than $50 a month. Well, the nursing home you chose, the nursing home you put me in so I wouldn't be inconvenient anymore. That's not why. Then why, Blaine? Why exactly did you put your mother in this place? The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words he couldn't say. Because Lilia wanted me gone. Because I was a reminder of their failure to honor his father's memory. Because it was easier to hide me away than deal with the guilt of how they'd treated me. The house has to be sold, he said finally. I'm sorry. I hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, I sat in the common room with Eleanor and Mrs. Patterson, watching a game show on the television. But my mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning. You're thinking hard about something, Eleanor observed. Want to share? I looked at these 2 women, smart, experienced, reduced to watching television in a place that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Women who'd given their lives to family members who'd discarded them the moment they became inconvenient. What if I told you there was a way to take back some control? I said quietly. Not just for me, but for all of us. Mrs. Patterson muted the television. What do you mean? I mean, what if the people who put us here had to face real consequences for their actions? What if they discovered that we're not as powerless as they think? Eleanor's eyes sharpened. Go on. Some of us in this place aren't as helpless as our families believe. Some of us have resources they don't know about, power they've forgotten we have. I thought about the documents Marcus was preparing, about the bomb I was about to drop on Blaine and Lilia's carefully constructed life. Are you talking about fighting back? Mrs. Patterson asked. I'm talking about justice, I said. I'm talking about reminding our families that respect isn't optional, and that treating people badly has consequences. Eleanor leaned forward. What kind of consequences? I smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a real smile, the kind that changes everything. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but this time, I wasn't going to wait for the storm to pass. I was going to be the storm. The emergency shareholders meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10. I had Marcus arrange it under the pretense of addressing the company's financial crisis. What Blaine didn't know was that I'd called the meeting myself, as the majority shareholder of Hartwell Industries. I chose my outfit carefully, my best navy dress, the one I'd worn to board meetings back when Richard was alive. I'd had Eleanor help me with my hair, pulling it back into the severe bun I used to wear when I meant business. You look like you're going to war, Eleanor said approvingly. I am. The taxi ride to the Hartwell Industries building felt like a journey back in time. I hadn't been here since Richard's funeral, when Blaine had insisted I didn't need to worry about complicated business matters anymore. The conference room was exactly as I remembered it. Mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the industrial district Richard had helped develop. Blaine sat at the head of the table in his father's chair, papers scattered in front of him. He looked up when I entered, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and annoyance. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Lilia was beside him, dressed in another expensive outfit I'd probably paid for. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on the table. "This is a business meeting, Sloane," she said coldly. "Not a social visit." I took the seat at the opposite end of the table, my usual spot from the old days. Marcus entered behind me, carrying a leather briefcase that made Lilia's eyes narrow with suspicion. "Blaine," I said calmly, "I called this meeting." He blinked. "You called it? Mom, you're not—" He stopped, seeming to realize how that sentence would sound. "I'm not what? Not part of this company?" I folded my hands on the table. "Marcus, would you please explain to my son exactly what his mother's role in Hartwell Industries is?" Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "Mrs. Sloane Hartwell owns 75% of Hartwell Industries Inc. She has been the majority shareholder since the company's incorporation in 1987. The silence that followed was absolute. Blaine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Lilia went completely still, her face draining of color. "That's impossible," Blaine finally managed. "Dad left the company to me. I saw the will. The will left you 25% ownership and operational control," Marcus continued, his voice professionally neutral. "However, your father structured the ownership to protect your mother's interests. She has always held the controlling stake." I watched my son process this information, saw the exact moment when the implications hit him. Every decision he'd made, every contract he'd canceled, every employee he'd fired, all of it had been done with my property. "You knew?" Lilia's voice was barely a whisper. "All this time you knew?" "I knew," I said simply. "Just like I knew when you decided to put me in a nursing home. Just like I knew when you sold my personal belongings. Just like I knew when you put my house on the market." Blaine found his voice. "Mom, if you owned the company, why didn't you say something? Why let me—" "Destroy it?" I finished. "Because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become without your father's guidance. I wanted to see if you'd earned the right to run his company." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. "And what's your assessment?" Lilia asked, her lawyer instincts kicking in despite her shock. I looked at my son, really looked at him, the boy I'd raised, the young man who'd graduated with honors, the husband and father who should have been everything Richard and I had dreamed he'd become. "My assessment is that you've failed. Completely." Blaine flinched as if I'd slapped him. "In 2 months, you've lost 40% of this company's revenue. You've laid off 37 employees, many of whom worked for your father for over a decade. You've made decisions based on spreadsheets instead of relationships, on quick profits instead of long-term stability." I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the factory floor. "But the business failures aren't what disappoint me most." "Then what?" Blaine's voice was small. I turned back to face them. "What disappoints me is that you put your own mother in a substandard nursing home and sold her house to cover your mistakes. What disappoints me is that you convinced yourself I was a burden instead of a resource. What disappoints me is that you forgot every value your father tried to teach you about family and loyalty and respect." Lilia straightened in her chair, her composure returning. "What do you want, Sloane? Money? An apology? What's this really about?" "This is about consequences," I said. "Blaine, you're fired. Effective immediately." He shot to his feet. "You can't fire me. This is my inheritance." "No," I said calmly. "This is my company. Your inheritance was the opportunity to prove yourself worthy of running it. You've proven the opposite." Marcus placed a document in front of me. "Mrs. Hartwell, this removes Blaine Hartwell from all operational roles within the company. Effective immediately. Your signature is required." I signed my name with steady hands. "What about the bankruptcy filing?" Lilia demanded. "Will be withdrawn. I'm injecting capital to stabilize operations." I looked at Blaine, whose face had gone ashen. "The company will survive, under new management." "Mom, please," Blaine said, his voice breaking. "I made mistakes, but I can learn. I can do better." For a moment I wavered. He was still my son. I still loved him, despite everything. But then I thought about Mrs. Patterson, crying over her grandson's empty promises. I thought about Eleanor, whose daughter had stolen her money. I thought about all the women at Sunset Manor who'd been discarded by families they'd sacrificed everything for. You had your chance, Blaine. You chose to see me as a burden instead of asking for my help. You chose to hide me away instead of honoring me. Those weren't business decisions. They were character decisions. And character can't be taught to a 40-year-old man. I gathered my purse and stood. Marcus will handle the transition details. I trust you can see yourselves out. As I reached the door, Lilia's voice stopped me. This is cruel, Sloane. He's your son. I turned back one last time. Yes, he is. And if I don't hold him accountable for his actions, who will? Sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their choices. I left them sitting in that conference room, surrounded by the wreckage of their assumptions about power and control, and who really owned what. Outside, the taxi was waiting to take me back to Sunset Manor, but not for long. I had some phone calls to make. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, watching the morning light stream through windows that actually opened. The house was smaller than the one Lilia had sold, a comfortable ranch-style place with a garden where I could grow the tomatoes Richard and I used to tend together. The coffee was brewing when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Eleanor holding a covered dish. "Thought you might like some of my famous coffee cake," she said when I opened the door. Mrs. Patterson helped with the recipe. Eleanor had been the first to move out of Sunset Manor after I'd purchased a small apartment building downtown and converted it into affordable senior housing. Real senior housing, with dignity and respect and activities that actually mattered to the residents. "How is Mrs. Patterson settling in?" I asked, leading Eleanor to my bright, airy kitchen. "Oh, she loves her new place. And guess what? Her grandson finally visited. Seems like having his grandmother living somewhere respectable made it easier for him to face her." I poured coffee into china cups, my grandmother's set, which I'd managed to retrieve from storage before Lilia could sell it. "Any word from Blaine?" Eleanor asked gently. I'd been expecting this question. In the 6 months since I'd reclaimed control of my life, my son had called exactly 3 times. The first call was angry, threats about legal action that his lawyer had quickly advised him to drop. The second was bargaining, promises to do better if I'd just give him another chance. The third, just last week, had been different. "He called to tell me he got a job," I said. "Entry-level position at a small manufacturing company. He's starting over. How do you feel about that?" I considered the question while stirring cream into my coffee. Hopeful. For the first time since his father died, Blaine is learning what work actually means. What it's like to earn something instead of inherit it. The truth was more complicated. I missed my son. I missed the relationship we'd had before Richard's death, before grief and greed had changed him into someone I barely recognized, but I didn't regret my decision. What about Lilia? Divorced. The papers were finalized last month. I took a sip of coffee, savoring the rich taste. Apparently, Blaine wasn't quite as attractive without the trust fund and the company position. Eleanor shook her head. Some people only love what you can give them. After Eleanor left, I drove to the Hartwell Industries building for my weekly check-in. The new CEO, a woman named Sarah Chen who'd worked her way up from the factory floor, had stabilized operations and won back 2 of the contracts Blaine had lost. "The Johnson Manufacturing people want to meet with you personally," Sarah told me as we reviewed the quarterly reports. "They're interested in expanding their relationship with us." "Set it up," I said, "but make sure they understand that this is your company to run. I'm just the owner." It was an important distinction. I'd learned from watching Blaine that ownership and management were different skills entirely. Sarah understood the business in ways my son never had. From the ground up, with respect for the people who actually made the products. That afternoon, I stopped by the senior center I'd helped establish in the old Hartwell building downtown. It was busier than usual, with a painting class in the main room and a book club meeting in the library. "Sloane." Mrs. Patterson waved from her easel, where she was working on a landscape that would have made any art teacher proud. "Come see what I've been painting." The canvas showed a garden in full bloom, bursting with colors and life. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was hopeful. "It's my dream garden," she explained. "The one I never had time to plant when I was taking care of everyone else." "Are you going to plant it for real?" I asked. Her eyes lit up. "Actually, yes. There's a community garden behind my new apartment building. I've already signed up for a plot." This was what I'd wanted to create. Not just better housing for older adults, but better lives. Places where people could discover new dreams instead of just waiting for their old ones to fade. As I drove home that evening, I passed by my old house. The new owners had painted it a different color and changed the landscaping, but it was clearly loved and well-maintained. A swing set in the backyard suggested children live there now, children who would grow up in the rooms where I'd raised Blaine. I felt a moment of sadness, but it passed quickly. That house belonged to my past. My future was in the smaller, brighter home where I could live on my own terms. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. "Mom? It's Blaine." I sat in my car, engine still running, and waited. "I wanted to call because I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind I gave you before when I was just trying to get something back." His voice sounded different, tired, but not defeated. Humbled, but not broken. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately," he continued. "About the things he tried to teach me that I didn't want to learn. About how he always said that respect isn't automatic. It's earned." I closed my eyes, hearing Richard's voice in my son's words. "I didn't respect you, Mom. I treated you like you were in the way, like you didn't matter. And I told myself it was because I was protecting you, or because I knew what was best for you, but really, I was just scared and angry and taking it out on the person who couldn't fight back." "Blaine? No. Let me finish. Please." He took a shaky breath. "I lost everything. The company, my marriage, my house, my savings, everything. And you know what the worst part is? I deserve to lose it all. Not because of the business mistakes, but because of how I treated you." I sat in my driveway, listening to my son finally understand what his father had spent 40 years trying to teach him about character and consequences. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me," he said. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what I lost, and I understand why you did what you did." "Blaine," I said softly, "I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't respect your choices. I never stopped being your mother. Could we maybe have dinner sometime? Nothing fancy, just, I'd like to try to earn back the right to be your son again." I looked at my house, small, comfortable, mine, and thought about the life I'd built from the ashes of the one that had been taken from me. "I'd like that," I said, "but Blaine, you'll need to earn it. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about rebuilding trust, and trust takes time." "I understand. I have time. And Mom, I'm proud of what you've built. The senior center, the housing project, the way you saved the company. Dad would be proud too." After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few more minutes, watching the sunset paint my little house in golden light. Tomorrow, I would tend my garden and check on my tenants and meet with my managers. I would live a life built on my own choices, my own values, my own definition of what mattered. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, confused, discarded, supposedly powerless. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that power isn't about control over others, but about control over your own destiny. Some storms destroy everything in their path, but sometimes, if you're strong enough to weather them, they clear away everything that was holding you back and leave you free to build something better. I got out of my car and walked toward my front door, toward my new life, toward the future I'd chosen for myself. Behind me, the storm clouds were finally gone. Now I'm curious about you, who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.